Moinsen, this is Sebastian and I created a photo booth for my cousin's wedding with a Game Boy camera and a Game Boy printer. If you've been following my channel for a while, you might have seen the bullet time video booth that I made for one of my cousins. It's a rather large setup with 13 cameras, allowing wedding guests to record short clips of themselves with a bullet time effect. Well, I got a whole stash of cousins, so when the next one got married, it was time for a new video booth. Unfortunately, his wedding location didn't have space for the big bullet time setup, so I had to come up with something new to make his video booth special. Luckily, he likes retro games, so it was a no-brainer. I made a video booth that combines my modern camera with my old Game Boy camera and added a photo booth feature to the video booth to print out stills through my old Game Boy printer. So let me tell you how I supplemented my 24 megapixel cameras with additional epic 14 kilopixels. When the Game Boy video booth is not in use, it shows the clips recorded by other guests. You could say it has an attract mode. When guests push the green button, they get instructions which nobody ever reads and another press proceeds to the countdown. At the end of the countdown, both my Sony and the Game Boy camera record a 5-second video clip. Then, after a short processing time, the guests can review the results and choose to either keep or discard the recording with the green or red button. Finally, they also get to choose if they want to print stills of their video clip to the Game Boy printer. At the heart of the setup, there is a Raspberry Pi 4 talking to the push buttons, my Sony camera, the Game Boy with the Game Boy camera and the Game Boy printer. It is all tied together with a Python script implementing a web interface. What you see on the screen is a web browser showing that web interface. It is all running locally, but creating a UI with frame-exact playback of multiple videos is much easier to do in HTML and JavaScript. The big push buttons are exactly the same I used for my bullet time video booth. It is a Raspberry Pi Pico W acting as a Bluetooth low energy keyboard, sending a single button press to the Raspberry Pi. In the past I was worried about the weird license of the example this is based on, but by now I also have released my modified source code, which you can find through the blog article for this project at There Ought to Be. Link is in the video description. The main camera is my good old Sony a6400. Unfortunately, there are no good combinations of being able to record in good quality while also being able to control the camera and transfer the result for a preview. USB modes do not support control and video transfer at the same time, neither does Wi-Fi control on this model, and capturing the clean HDMI output is tricky for the Raspberry Pi while capturing the Game Boy camera at the same time. So I use a rather exotic combination that works super reliably. I control the camera via Bluetooth, which is exactly the use case that inspired me to write the Bluetooth remote control app for Sony cameras from my previous video. When the recording is done, I download the video file via Wi-Fi from a Wi-Fi SD card in the camera. Yeah, that sounds absurdly complicated, but it is by far the most reliable solution I could find. Now let's finally get to the cool parts of the setup, the Game Boy stuff. Let's start with the Game Boy camera. This is in fact the exact Game Boy camera from my childhood and therefore the first digital camera I ever owned. Capturing it is really easy because I'm simply running it in a real Game Boy with my GB interceptor in between. It is not in the typical 3D printed case because I'm using the extension board with a longer ribbon cable, so it's easier to align the camera. Since I already made a video about the GB interceptor and even gave an entire talk at the Chaos Communication Congress on how it works, I will not explain all the details. What it does is that I can simply get a regular MJPEG stream of the Game Boy image via USB-C. I just plug it into the Raspberry Pi and start recording from the Game Boy like from a normal USB webcam. Oh, and it could have been any Game Boy to run the camera. I just used the Game Boy Pocket because I had a spare power supply with dummy AAA batteries that only fit in the Game Boy Pocket. But the star of the setup is the Game Boy printer. This one is also the original one from my childhood. Well, actually, my brother also owns half of it. And who would have thunk it? The old paper that was left in the printer is still working. Of course, I needed more paper for the wedding and I did not want to use up the remainder of this historical artifact. Turns out, you can use any thermal paper if the format fits. So I got a healthy supply. Talking to the Game Boy printer also was not too difficult. The protocol has been well documented by the Game Boy developer community and all I needed is another microcontroller to interface with it. Now, after using 2 Pi Picos in the push buttons, a Raspberry Pi 4 as the main controller and an RP2040 in the GB interceptor, you might be expecting another Fruity controller in here. But A, they're not sponsoring me, and B, the Game Boy printer is old school in that it uses a 5V logic level. So I pulled a random alternative from my microcontroller box and ended up with the 5V variant of the Pro Micro. I wrote some minimalistic code to pass the SPI style communication of the Game Boy printer to a serial USB interface, and the rest is done in a Python module I wrote for this. It is all wrapped up in a simple command that prints arbitrary images. If you want to use it for any of your projects, check out my blog at there ought to be. Link is still in the description. Oh, and I highly recommend using dummy AA batteries. Also, be aware that printing takes a moment, even though I'm already transmitting data at a higher rate than the actual Game Boy could. And what can I say? Except for having to refill the printer paper twice, the setup worked flawlessly without any supervision. I packed all recordings into a fun video with music selected by the couple. Of course, I mostly used the recordings from my Sony and only occasionally mixed it with the Game Boy camera footage. My cousin was super happy with the result. Oh, and to everyone who has been asking for an explanation of the high color graphics from the previous video, sorry about that, I haven't forgotten it, it just didn't fit in here. You might have to wait a little longer for that. Sorry. If you want to reuse parts of my photo booth, check out my blog at there ought to be, which links to the source code. The project is somewhat specific to the exact hardware that I used, but some parts of it, like printing on the Game Boy printer, should be nicely reusable. And with that, I'm out. Ciao!